I knew something was wrong the second I stepped back into that fluorescent-lit purgatory they called an office. 2 weeks out for minor surgery, and my desk felt like a crime scene, papers I'd never seen before stacked on my chair, my nameplate shoved to the side, and a faint smell of someone else's cologne lingering in the air. The chair still had the imprint of someone larger than me, like it had been claimed. I didn't have to wonder long who'd parked himself there. He found me before I even got my coat off. "Ah, you must be the compliance lady," he said, with the smug smile of a man who thinks remembering your job title is a favor. Loud voice, tailored suit, one of those Bluetooth earpieces that make a person look permanently self-important. "I'm your new VP, Greg. Sales background, fast results, no nonsense. Don't worry, I'll keep the paperwork light for you." Before I could respond, he tossed out the line that's been etched into my brain ever since. "Your title was inflated anyway." Said it like he was doing me a kindness, letting me in on the little joke that my entire career was some kind of harmless puffery. I smiled, professional, because what else do you do when someone decides to spit in your face without moving their lips? It was right then I decided, fine, Greg, you don't respect the title, let's see how you handle the job. I would write down everything. Every skipped signature, every fast-track shortcut, every moment where his swagger outweighed his judgment. Not to get him, oh no, that's what he'd assume. I'd just be doing my job, thoroughly. And before I go further, since apparently 97% of people listen to these stories without hitting subscribe, maybe do that now. It keeps the team making these and, frankly, makes sitting through this kind of corporate comedy feel a little less like suffering alone. The first meeting with him set the tone. He was all about streamlining, which in Greg speak meant stripping away anything that slowed him down, like legally mandated verification steps. He waved off the orientation packet. I offered like I'd just handed him a stack of outdated coupons. "I'll figure it out," he said, already looking at his phone. "Been closing deals longer than you've been reading about them." Greg strutted into the department like a man entering a bar he already owned. He wanted numbers, speed, and no boring compliance crap dragging things down. I watched him run through a presentation for upper management, charts flying by, timelines cut in half, costs shaved to unbelievable levels. Everyone clapped because everyone loves unbelievable, until they remember it's also a synonym for not true. He didn't ask me for a single piece of input, not one. My predecessor had fought tooth and nail to make sure our department never hit the wrong side of an audit, and Greg seemed determined to undo that work before lunch. He made little jokes at my expense in front of the team about the compliance police and overkill paperwork. It was meant to be charming banter, but it was really just him staking territory. I took notes, dates, times, direct quotes. I started keeping digital copies of everything, not on the company server, but in a private, encrypted archive. I wrote my emails with surgical precision, documenting irregularities without emotion. The man didn't realize every "don't worry about it" was another nail in a coffin he hadn't even noticed being built. Greg's favorite phrase was "it's not rocket science." He used it to dismiss any policy he didn't understand, which was most of them. He'd nod through explanations, then turn to his assistant and whisper something about bureaucratic nonsense. That first week alone, I caught him signing off on a report missing 4 critical approval steps. When I pointed it out, he grinned like I was being adorable. "You worry too much. That's why I'm here, balance you out." Balance, right? Like putting a brick on the gas pedal and calling it balancing the car's performance. By Friday, I'd sent him 3 formal warning emails, each one outlining the specific regulation he was ignoring, the potential penalties, and the corrective steps. He ignored all of them. No reply, no acknowledgement. I imagined them sitting in his inbox like unopened bills, each subject line a quiet reminder that the clock was ticking. This was going to be interesting. Not because I liked office politics, I didn't, but because I'd been in this game long enough to know that arrogance and government oversight do not mix well. And Greg was the walking embodiment of both. So I did what I do best. I kept my head down, my tone polite, my record spotless. And every time Greg laughed at my inflated title, I thought about how light his tone would sound when he tried to explain himself to someone with a badge. Didn't take long for Greg's streamlining to start leaving paper trails that smelled like gasoline. The first real jolt came on a Tuesday afternoon, when a quarterly report landed on my desk for final review. Normally, these documents are neat little bundles, signed by the right managers, dated correctly, every compliance box ticked like a row of soldiers. This one looked like it had been slapped together during a commercial break. The first page had the wrong revision date, off by almost 2 months, which meant either the data was stale or someone had backdated it to look current. Half the required signatures were missing, replaced with blank spaces. And the compliance section, the part that certifies the work met all legal standards, wasn't just incomplete. It was unchecked entirely, like Greg hadn't even pretended to review it. I took a slow breath because in this line of work, rushing is how you get sloppy. I pulled the prior quarter's file and compared them side by side. Sure enough, there were little fixes in Greg's version, numbers rounded up, expense lines trimmed, dates shifted forward. Not errors, choices, intentional ones. That's when the voice in my head changed from irritated to alert. Incompetence is one thing. You can train incompetence out of a person, at least sometimes. But this wasn't that. This was willful negligence, the kind that looks harmless until you remember every harmless decision here is tied to federal reporting laws. I drafted my first formal warning email. No emotion, no accusations, just facts. I listed each irregularity with bullet points, cited the relevant regulation, and included a polite but clear request for corrections before submission. I CC'd only Greg because at this stage, it was about giving him the benefit of the doubt. I read it twice before hitting send, then I saved a copy. Not on the company server, my own encrypted archive, labeled and timestamped. Greg's reply came 2 hours later. Got it, he wrote. No corrections followed, no questions. Just those two words, like checking a box in a conversation he had no intention of finishing. The next day, another document came through, this one a vendor certification with the signature line clearly forged. Because I'd seen the vendor's actual signature a dozen times, and this one looked like someone had tried to copy it while signing a birthday card on a moving bus. The date didn't even match the shipment logs. I walked into Greg's office, closed the door, and set the paper on his desk. This can't go forward, I said, tapping the signature. It's invalid. We need a real sign-off. He glanced at it for all of 3 seconds before shrugging. They're on vacation. It's fine. They'll approve it when they're back. That's not how this works, I said evenly. If we submit this, it's falsified. Greg leaned back, smirking like I'd just recited a fairy tale. You've been in this department too long. Sometimes you have to bend a little to keep things moving. I didn't argue. There's no winning a fight with someone who thinks rules are optional. I just went back to my desk, documented the exchange word for word, and sent my second warning email. This one CC'd to his assistant for a sliver of visibility. Saved that one too. Over the next week, the pattern repeated. Missing approval forms. Safety inspections marked as complete when the logs showed no such thing. Certifications backdated to avoid late penalties. Each time I flagged it in writing. Each time he either brushed it off or ignored me entirely. By Friday, I had 5 emails in my private archive, each one a small, sharp blade in a file that was starting to look less like an insurance policy and more like a loaded weapon. I wasn't aiming it yet, but I knew that when the right moment came, it wouldn't miss. Greg, for his part, seemed oblivious. He strutted through the office like a man who just discovered speed limits were optional, convinced he could outrun any consequence. I watched him, silent, every irregularity etched into the record in black and white. He thought he was untouchable. I thought about how fast that can change when the wrong person starts asking the right questions. By the third week, my inbox looked like the world's most monotonous crime novel, page after page of the same plot. Greg skips a step, I document it, Greg ignores it. If my job had been to collect exhibits for a future trial, I was overachieving. Warning email number 6 was about a procurement request that somehow forgot the competitive bidding requirement. Number 7 flagged a training log that showed 24 employees certified for safety procedures they'd never actually attended. Number 8 caught a blatant date alteration on a hazardous materials disposal form. Each one was written with the same calm, professional tone, the kind of language auditors love because it's unemotional, precise, and impossible to misinterpret. And each one earned the same response from Greg: silence, dismissal, or a chuckle like I was some adorable hall monitor overreacting to a playground scuffle. But it wasn't just the documents anymore. I started overhearing him. Greg had a habit of holding court in the break room like it was his personal stage. One morning, while I was refilling my coffee, I caught him telling a couple of junior staffers about how he'd fast-tracked a shipment by skipping what he called pointless compliance hoops. His words. He even threw in a little mock salute and said, "Sorry, officer paperwork, but some of us have real work to do." I didn't say anything. Just stirred my coffee, walked out, and added fast-tracking admission verbal to my notes. Because here's the thing, those pointless steps, they were federally mandated safety checks. Skipping them wasn't efficiency, it was negligence with a side of fraud. By now, I'd sent him 12 warnings. 12. Each one tied to a specific regulation, each with the potential to cost the company thousands or worse, its license to operate. And every time, Greg acted like I'd just told him the copy paper was low. It was around warning number 15 that my mindset shifted. At first, I'd been trying to do my job, protect the company, keep us in the guide this overconfident idiot back onto the rails. But when someone tells you, without words, that they have no interest in being saved, you stop trying to save them. You start making sure that when they fall, the landing is all theirs. I stopped thinking of my archive as just in case and started treating it like evidence. Not because I wanted revenge, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't picture the look on his face when he realized what he'd done. But because it was clear now, this wasn't an accident. This was a man who knew exactly what the rules were and decided they didn't apply to him. It became almost routine. Greg would hand me a file, I'd review it, find the problem, send the warning, save the copy. Sometimes I'd overhear him on the phone with a vendor, bragging about how he could make red tape disappear. Sometimes he'd pop into my office with a grin, toss a report on my desk, and say, "Don't look too hard at that one, okay?" Like we were co-conspirators, like my silence was guaranteed. The arrogance was breathtaking and dangerous, because the more he got away with, the bolder he became. The violations weren't just sloppy anymore, they were blatant. I found an inspection form with every box checked pass, even though the equipment in question had been flagged as defective in our own maintenance logs. I caught him signing off on a safety drill that never happened. By week 6, my private archive held 27 meticulously documented violations: dates, times, scans, transcripts of conversations. If an auditor asked for proof, I could hand them a folder so complete they'd think it was prepared by a prosecutor. Greg still had no idea. To him, I was just the quiet compliance officer who sent too many emails. To me, he was a walking time bomb with his own name etched on the detonator, and I was done trying to cut the wires. Now, I was just waiting for someone to push the button. By the time my violation count hit the low 30s, I decided it was time to escalate. Not for drama, not to start a war, just to follow protocol. If your direct supervisor ignores documented compliance breaches, you go up the chain. It's written in black and white in the handbook Greg clearly never opened. So I scheduled a meeting with HR, sat across from a woman whose face was permanently set to pleasant, but rushed and laid it all out. Forged signatures, falsified dates, skipped safety protocols, the works. I even brought sanitized copies of 3 violations as examples, with all the identifying vendor info redacted so I couldn't be accused of spreading sensitive data. She skimmed them, nodded at all the right moments, then leaned back in her chair and said, "Well, new VP has full operational control now. We're supposed to support his vision." Support his vision. I bit the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper. His vision was a regulatory nightmare waiting to happen, but apparently as long as the quarterly numbers looked good, the rest could rot. Next stop was the CFO. If HR wouldn't listen, maybe someone with a fiduciary responsibility to protect the company's assets would care about millions in potential fines. I walked him through a handful of the more obvious breaches. He barely glanced at the papers before sighing like I'd just interrupted his lunch. "Greg knows what he's doing," he said. "He's here to make us leaner and faster. Let him do his job." That was the moment it hit me. Every official channel was blocked. Not clogged, blocked. They weren't just ignoring me, they decided Greg's shortcuts were worth the risk. And if the risk ever exploded in their faces, could all play dumb and point at him, so I adjusted. I stopped wasting energy on persuading people who'd already decided not to care. Instead, I made sure every warning email went wider. I started CCing multiple managers, not just Greg, but his assistant, operations, and a couple of mid-level directors. No accusations, just factual outlines of the irregularities, the relevant regulation, and what needed to be fixed. Of course, no one responded. Not one person hit reply, all to thank me for catching a forged vendor certification or a backdated safety form. But every one of those emails had a digital trail now, with a neat little read receipt attached. Which meant if anyone tried to claim ignorance later, I could point to a tidy list of who had opened what and when. Oddly enough, once I accepted I was being ignored, it became easier. There's a strange satisfaction in knowing you're not just shouting into the void. You're building a file so dense and undeniable it could double as a paperweight for a judge's desk. Greg, meanwhile, had started to believe his own myth. He dropped by my office to boast about shaving 2 weeks off a process, conveniently leaving out that the missing fortnight was supposed to be spent on federally required inspections. In staff meetings, he'd make little quips about our compliance expert over here, and everyone would chuckle politely. I chuckled too, not because it was funny, but because I knew every joke, every dismissive wave of his hand, was another line in the narrative I was quietly compiling. He thought my emails were just busy work, clutter in his inbox. He didn't understand they were the foundation of a case that, when the right people finally looked, make it impossible for him to talk his way out, so I kept sending them. 31 warnings became 38, each one logged, time-stamped, and archived in 2 separate encrypted drives. I stopped thinking of it as my job and started thinking of it as my insurance policy. If no one inside the company cared to stop Greg, someone outside eventually would. All I had to do was be ready. The notice came in on a Monday morning, slipped into my inbox like any other routine memo, except it wasn't. Subject line, Notice of Federal Compliance Review. My eyes went straight to the bolded date at the top, 4 weeks from now. The agency's name alone was enough to make every seasoned compliance officer sit a little straighter. These weren't the kind of auditors you could charm over coffee. They were meticulous, humorless, and fully authorized to dig until they found something worth prosecuting. I read it twice, then a third time, letting the reality settle in. This wasn't a hypothetical anymore. Every forged signature, every skipped inspection, every falsified date Greg had cheerfully waved off for the last 2 months, that was now a live grenade with the pin halfway out. Greg got the same notice. I know because 5 minutes later, his booming voice summoned the entire department into the conference room. I took my usual seat near the back, notebook ready, because meetings like this had a way of producing the kind of quotes auditors love. He paced in front of the whiteboard like a motivational speaker who'd just been told his job depended on making everyone forget the last 2 months existed. All right, team, he began, clapping his hands together. We've got some housekeeping to do before our friends from the federal office show up. Housekeeping. That was his euphemism. He started outlining what he called scrubbing the documents, going back through the last 18 months of records and correcting anything that didn't line up. He didn't use the word falsify, but he didn't have to. His instructions were clear: change dates, add missing signatures, retroactively check boxes that had been left blank. Make it clean, he said, so clean they could eat off it. There was a flicker of discomfort in the room, people glancing at one another, shuffling papers. But no one spoke. That's the thing about corporate fear, it's silent. Then his eyes landed on me. And I'm going to need your help especially, he said, pointing in my direction. You've got the best handle on all the details, just smooth them out. I didn't even blink. You mean falsify them, I said evenly. A few heads turned. Greg laughed, but it wasn't his usual full-bodied laugh, it was tight, a little forced. No, just fix the inconsistencies. We're all on the same team here. I kept my voice calm. If the inconsistencies are real, they're not mine to fix. They're for the auditors to review. The silence that followed was heavier than any I'd heard in that room. Someone coughed. Greg looked at me for a beat too long before forcing a smile and moving on to his next bullet point. But the tension lingered. Everyone knew exactly what I'd just said and what it meant. When the meeting broke, I went back to my desk and did nothing differently. I didn't touch a single record outside of the normal review process, but I did open my private archive and scan the list. 41 documented violations, each backed by evidence. The pile was complete enough to stand on its own. That afternoon, Greg swung by my office and leaned against the doorframe. You know, he said in a lower voice, this doesn't have to be a big deal. They're not going to look that hard. I met his gaze, you might be right, or they might look exactly that hard. He smirked like I was overreacting, but there was a flicker of something else. Maybe for the first time, he realized I wasn't just the quiet compliance officer sending annoying emails. I was the one person in this building who could hand those auditors a roadmap to his front door. I didn't plan to tip them off. I didn't need to. In less than a month, they'd be here asking for everything. And when they did, truth wouldn't need my commentary. It was already printed, signed, dated, and sitting neatly in my encrypted folders. I closed the archive, locked my screen, and went to get coffee. 4 weeks. That's all the time Greg had left before his shortcuts became headlines. By the end of that week, the number sat in front of me like a milestone I hadn't intended to reach. Warning email #42. 42 separate instances of Greg ignoring, dismissing, or outright mocking documented compliance breaches, each one a thread in a rope he'd been happily wrapping around his own neck. This one wasn't like the others. It wasn't just a list of errors, it was a map of his entire misconduct. I itemized each fresh violation from the last few days: falsified inspection logs, forged vendor sign-offs, retroactively completed safety drills that never happened, and next to each, I cited the exact regulation breached. Then, for good measure, I listed the potential penalties: fines in the tens of thousands, license suspensions, and in 2 particularly egregious cases, criminal charges. No drama, no you need to fix this or else. Just facts lined up like dominoes, ready for gravity to take over. I addressed it directly to him, no CCs this time. This one was between me, him, and the future. I hit send and watched the little paper airplane icon disappear. Then I saved the outgoing email, the delivery receipt, and the read confirmation to my archive. 42 entries now, stacked in perfect chronological order, each stamped with the date, time, and his lack of action. His reply came 7 minutes later. A single laughing emoji followed by, "Relax, this isn't life or death." I stared at the screen for a long moment, not because I was shocked. Greg's arrogance had been consistent enough to chart like a weather pattern, because that sentence landed differently. It was the purest distillation of how little he understood the weight of his own actions. Compliance wasn't life or death to him because he'd never been the one holding the liability. I didn't bother replying. There was nothing left to say, nothing I hadn't already written 41 times before. My role in this story had shifted. I was no longer the warning voice in the back of the room. I was the custodian of the truth. In less than a month, someone with a badge and subpoena power was going to want to see it. That afternoon, Greg swaggered into the break room while I was pouring coffee, regaling a couple of junior staffers with a story about how he'd cleaned up a messy report for the auditors. They laughed along, oblivious to the fact that cleaned up was his euphemism for altered until unrecognizable. I didn't interrupt. I didn't even look up. On the walk back to my desk, I felt something settle in me, a cold, precise clarity. For weeks, I'd been trying to thread the impossible needle, protect the company, protect my own integrity, and maybe, in some distant way, give Greg the chance to realize what he was doing before it swallowed him whole. That window had closed. Now, I wasn't going to interfere, nudge, or warn. The next move belonged to the auditors. They'd ask for records. I'd give them exactly what they requested. No less, no more. Just the unvarnished history of the last few months, laid out in his own inaction. I opened my archive one last time before shutting down for the day, scrolling slowly through the subject lines. Every email was a mile marker on the road to the moment when not life or death would become a very different conversation for Greg. And when that moment came, I'd be ready to hand over the map. The request came in at 9:14 on a Wednesday morning, polite and surgical in its wording. Please provide all compliance-related correspondence, documentation, and certifications for the past 18 months. No special emphasis, no hint of suspicion, just the kind of formality that makes most people exhale in relief. I didn't exhale. I sat back in my chair, reread the line twice, and felt that slow, deliberate shift inside me. This was the moment, not a warning, not a hypothetical. Federal request for records was not a drill, and the only thing I had to do now was exactly what they'd asked. I opened my private archive. 42 folders, one for each warning email, each folder containing the email itself, the attachments, the supporting documents, and where applicable, screenshots or scans of the original falsified records. Every entry was complete, neat, and self-contained. I'd been building it for months. Now it looked like it had been designed for exactly this day. I attached the first 10 folders to an email addressed to the lead auditor. Then the next 10. Then the next. 4 separate emails in total, each with a subject line that matched their request exactly. No commentary, no editorializing. Just the information they'd asked for, exactly as it had existed in real time, with timestamps and original metadata intact. I didn't need to explain what they were looking at. They'd see it. The missing signatures, the altered dates, the unchecked compliance boxes, the forged vendor approvals, and beside each one my original warning, documenting the irregularity, citing the regulation, requesting correction, and his silence in reply. When the last email sent, I didn't feel triumph. Not yet. What I felt was release. Like setting down a heavy box I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten what my arms felt like without it. Greg was 3 desks away, chatting on the phone with someone about a big win he'd landed. He had no idea. No idea that the entire record of his negligence and fraud was, at that very moment, landing in the inbox of people whose job was to notice every single one of his shortcuts. I went back to my normal work, reviewed a shipping log, dated a certification tracker, answered a vendor question. All the while, the clock in the corner of my screen kept ticking, marking the minutes until the chain reaction started. At 9:58, I got the read receipt for the first email. At 10:02, the second. By 10:07, all 4 had been opened. I imagined the auditors leaning in over their screens, clicking open attachments, cross-referencing my warnings against the doctored reports. If they were thorough, they would be. Greg's name was already highlighted on more than one internal note. Still, I said nothing. I didn't watch him. I didn't hint. The power in this moment was in its quiet. I'd done my part months ago, one email at a time. This was just delivery day. By 10:20, the quiet in the office felt different. Not the usual mid-morning lull. This was heavier, more charged. A couple of people glanced toward the hallway that led to the executive offices. Phones were being picked up, then put down. Greg was still laughing into his headset, but his assistant kept glancing at her inbox like she'd just read something she couldn't unsee. I sipped my coffee, clicked to the next item on my task list, and kept my breathing steady. The move was done. The wheel was turning. And for the first time in months, the weight wasn't mine to carry anymore. It started as a ripple, one of those low murmurs that rides just under the hum of printers and keyboards. A question asked too quietly at the copy machine. A glance exchanged near the break room door. By 10:45, it had spread across the floor like a draft you can't quite place, and people were working with that strange, distracted half-focus of a room waiting for something to happen. My phone buzzed. A name I hadn't seen in months, Mark, my old colleague from the department before Greg arrived. The text was short, almost casual, except it hit like a hammer. Why are federal agents asking for him by name? I didn't answer. Just locked my phone and let the words settle. Agents, not auditors. Agents. That distinction isn't subtle. It's the difference between a compliance slap on the wrist and a full-blown criminal investigation. A few minutes later, movement caught my eye near the main entrance. 2 men in dark suits, badges clipped to their belts, were walking in step with building security. Not the kind of suits you see in client meetings. These were cut for work, not show, creased, understated, with the quiet weight of authority. They bypassed the reception desk entirely, heading straight for the executive hallway. I watched them disappear for a moment, then reappear at the far end, turning into the corridor that led to Greg's office. At 11:02, it came back into view, flanking him. No handcuffs yet, no raised voices, but his swagger was gone. He looked smaller, like the air had been let out of him. His suit jacket hung wrong on his shoulders, and there was a sheen on his forehead that hadn't been there an hour ago. They guided him, not dragged, not shoved, but guided into the large, glass-walled conference room. He went without protest, but the stiffness in his walk was telling. His usual bluster had evaporated, replaced with something tighter, quieter. I could see them through the glass from my desk. Greg sat alone on one side of the table, hunched forward, elbows on his knees. The agent stayed standing, flipping through manila folders, occasionally setting a page in front of him and speaking in low tones. Whatever was on those pages, it was draining the color from his face one shade at a time. The office noise dwindled to almost nothing. Phones stopped ringing. Keyboards went still. Everyone was pretending to work, but their eyes kept drifting toward the conference room. Even people who didn't like me, people who'd bought into Greg's fast-track swagger, were now quietly recalculating every interaction they'd had with him. I kept my posture neutral, my face unreadable. No smirk, no satisfaction broadcasted. Just the same quiet detachment I'd worn for months. Let them wonder if I knew more than they did. Let Greg wonder most of all. From where I sat, I could see him shift in his chair, run a hand through his hair, then lean back as one of the agents spoke again, tapping the table with a single finger for emphasis. Greg's mouth opened, closed. He nodded once slowly. Whatever they were saying, he'd stopped arguing. It happened at 11:46. The conference room door opened and the two agents stepped out first. Greg followed, but this time there was no mistaking it. His wrists were cuffed in front of him, the chain glinting in the overhead light. His head was down, jaw clenched, the image of a man who'd finally run out of road. The silence that fell over the floor was instant and absolute. Even the HVAC hum seemed to fade. Every eye tracked him as he passed, but no one said a word. This wasn't the noisy spectacle of TV arrests. It was quieter, heavier, more final. Words started to move in the way it always does in offices, through barely audible murmurs, hasty Slack messages, and the quick shuffle of someone grabbing coffee just to pass by the scene. By the time the agents reached the elevator, I'd already overheard 3 different charges whispered in disbelief: fraud, falsifying government compliance data, misuse of federal funds. The elevator doors closed. He was gone. Not 5 minutes later, an urgent all-staff email pinged in from the board's executive assistant. Emergency meeting at noon. Attendance mandatory. That was corporate speak for crisis containment. I didn't go. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what they'd be discussing, and more importantly, I knew exactly where the story they were being told came from. My name wouldn't be in it, it didn't have to be. The auditor's files would speak louder than I ever could, and every one of those 42 warning emails was a chapter in that unspoken narrative. At 11:59, I slid my resignation letter across my desk, addressed to HR, and hit print. It was short, 2 paragraphs, thanking the company for the years before Greg and noting my last day as effective immediately. No explanations, no bridge burning, just the clean exit of someone with nothing to defend and nothing left to prove. I placed it face up on my desk, locked my computer, and started packing. The few things I kept at the office, coffee mug, framed photo, a potted plant that had somehow survived both Greg and the winter, fit neatly into a single box. When the meeting upstairs broke, the hallway outside filled with a muted buzz of shock and speculation. No one stopped by my desk to ask questions. A few glanced in my direction, but if they suspected, they didn't say it out loud. That suited me fine, the less said, the more certain the truth would land exactly where it needed to. As I walked out, I passed the conference room where Greg had been just an hour earlier. The chairs were still pulled askew, one with a faint scuff mark where he'd sat. The folder the agents had used was gone, but I could picture it perfectly, page after page of my work, my words, the record he'd ignored until it wrapped around him like a net. The elevator doors slid shut in front of me, and for the first time in months, I felt the muscles in my shoulders loosen. My record was intact. His career, and likely his freedom, were gone, and I had never once raised my voice. Appreciate you sticking around, you legends of the break room. Subscribe for more chaos. Let's make your old managers spill their coffee in fear.